Good morning and welcome to Bible Truth for Kids. Today our story is called The Healing at the Pool of Bethesda. You know, many people have started to believe that Jesus is the Son of God, but some have not. In particular, the Pharisees, the religious leaders, they don't believe in him. And you know, they've started to cause problems for him. They have started following him. They've started arguing with him. They've started trying to catch him doing something wrong. And we are going to find out today, because of the healing in Bethesda, they are so angered that at the end of the story, we'll see that they're going to try and kill him. That's how much they hate him. We'll find out why. Now, there was some mystery surrounding the pools of Bethesda, and the mystery was bubbling water. Have you ever been in a hot tub where someone turns on the jets and the water starts bubbling? It's really quite a lot of fun, isn't it? Well, you know, there was no jets at the pool of Bethesda, but sometimes the water mysteriously started to bubble. It was stirred up. Now, they said it was an angel, that an angel came down and stirred up the waters, and that the first person into the water after it had been stirred up would be healed. And so there was always crowds at the pool of Bethesda. There was blind people, lame people, deaf people, anybody who was looking to be healed would come to the pools and try to be the first one in, but you never knew when the water was going to be stirred up. Now, the pools of Bethesda were close to the temple in Jerusalem. And the temple, of course, was the only place that you could go to offer sacrifices for sin. But the temple was also the place of many joyous occasions. Many feasts and festivals were held down there, like the Passover, the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Dedication. And the pools were close like this. Here's the temple. And here's where the pools are. You can see that they're quite close. So there was like a gate in the wall that you could go through to get there. And I'll show you a close-up of it so that you can see they were like this. There was actually two of them, and there was a dividing wall in between, and they were always crowded. Now, Jesus had been up in Galilee, and he was coming back to Jerusalem for one of the feasts of the Jews. We don't know which feast it was, but he went by the pools of Bethesda. It was crowded, and he went through and he saw a man who was lame. He had been lame for 38 years. That means his legs don't work. Now, this man didn't cry out to Jesus and call to him. He didn't even know who Jesus was. But Jesus went over to him and he said to him, "Do you want to be healed?" You know, usually people are coming to Jesus and asking him to heal them. But now Jesus goes to this man and says, "Do you want to be healed?" Well, he didn't answer right away. I mean, you know, he'd been there 38 years. If he was suddenly healed, well, he didn't have a home to go to. I mean, he didn't have a job he could do. He didn't have any friends. I mean, everybody knew who he was. He'd been there for 38 years. But, you know, he just looked at Jesus and he said, when the waters are stirred up, he says, I don't have anyone to help me to get down into the water. And if I try to go down the stairs myself, well, somebody always beats me to it. You know, but Jesus just looked at him and he said to him, "Get up, take up your bed and walk." Jesus didn't reach out his hand and try to lift him up. The man had to act in faith. But the man believed what Jesus said, and he stood up, and his legs were like brand new. They were strong. They weren't weak. They didn't wobble. And he rolled up his mat, and then he turned around, but Jesus had disappeared. Jesus had disappeared into the crowds, and so the man didn't even get a chance to say, "Well, who are you? What's your name?" He didn't know who it was, but he knew he was healed. I think he felt like this. Wouldn't you? After being healed, after 38 years, he left the pools. Now, Jesus had healed this man on the Sabbath. And the Sabbath was a special day set aside by God for rest from usual work. So the Jews didn't go to work like usual on the Sabbath. And it was also a day when you were to remember what God had done and what God was like. So we rest too, don't we? We don't work 7 days a week. We don't go to school 7 days a week. We rest on Saturday and Sunday. And the Sabbath day was the last day of the week, so that would be like our Saturday. That was their Sabbath. Now, on the Sabbath, people also went to what was called a synagogue. Synagogues weren't very fancy, but every town, even a little town in Israel, had a synagogue. And inside the synagogue, it looked like this, just very plain. These are windows up here. People just sit around there. And whoever was in charge of that particular synagogue, they would go over and they would take out the scrolls. That was the word of God. That were just on scrolls back then. They took out the scroll and they gave it to someone to read just where they left off from the week before. And the person would stand up in the synagogue and open the scroll and read from it. And then there would be some instruction, that explanation of what they just read, sort of like our preaching today. And there would be prayer. And you know, the Bible tells us that Jesus made a practice of going to a synagogue every week. Now, because Jesus had done this on the Sabbath, that was going to be a problem for the Pharisees. Because the Pharisees had added extra rules to the Sabbath. You know, God meant the Sabbath to be a delight, but they'd made it a burden. Because on the Sabbath, they said, you can't work. Well, if that's what God had said too, you were to rest from your work. But the Pharisees added 39 more rules to the Sabbath. They said, for instance, you can't give medicine to anyone on the Sabbath because that's work. You can't pluck grain even if you're hungry. You can't carry something from one place to another. That's work. You can't write. You can't stitch. I mean, it had become a burden for the people. And if they caught you doing any of those things on the Sabbath, they had some harsh punishments for the people. In fact, you could even be cast out of the synagogue. I mean, thrown out and barred from ever coming back again. It was very difficult. Now, remember I told you that the pools were close to the temple, not too far. And this is where the lame man, now that he was better, he went over to the temple. He wanted to walk around the temple. I mean, he hadn't done that for 38 years. But as he was going through the temple, the Pharisees saw him. And they said to him, it's unlawful for you to be carrying your bed on the Sabbath day. And the man said, well, it's the man that healed me. He told me just to take up my bed and, and to walk. You know, remember his bed? It was just like a straw mat, so it was easy to roll up. It was easy to carry. He had rolled it up and he was carrying it over his shoulders. The Pharisee said, Who healed you? Who told you? What's his name? Who told you you could carry your mat on the Sabbath? But the man said, I don't know. I don't know who it was. You know, he didn't know. Now, a little bit later, Jesus found the man in the temple. And, you know, he said to the man, now that you've been healed, you're not to sin anymore. And he told him who he was. He told him he was Jesus. You know, the man understood what Jesus was saying. But he also went back to the Pharisees and he said, well, you know, it was Jesus. That's who healed me. Well, I'm sure the Pharisees suspected it was Jesus anyways. You know, the Bible tells us that Jesus often healed on the Sabbath. Now, when the Pharisees found Jesus, they started to accuse him of breaking the Sabbath by healing that man. And Jesus just said, my Father is working even today, and I am working too. Well, what did that mean? Well, you know, God rested from creation on the seventh day. That was the Sabbath. God created the Sabbath. But Jesus never rests from protecting and directing his creation. I mean, babies are born, crops grow, the wind blows on the Sabbath like any other day. But you know, what most importantly the Pharisees picked up on was the fact that he said, "The Father and I are working together." That meant he was claiming to be God. Do you remember we talked a little bit before about how God the Father is God, and the Son is God. God is 3 in 1. It's difficult, it's a mysterious thing to understand, but it's true. All they heard was Jesus said, "I am equal to God the Father." And so they decided, we are going to figure out how to get rid of him. You know, their hearts had become as hard as a stone. They were blinded to who Jesus was. They did not want to acknowledge his good works, his teaching, his healing. They were nothing but fixated now on how they could get rid of him. Now, next week, we're going to find out that opposition to Jesus increases, but that doesn't stop Jesus. He's going to do two miracles that are very famous. So come back next week and you'll find out what they are. Bye for now.